right, my name is Jack Donovan, and you are listening to or watching Pater, PH2T3R, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host C.B. Robertson, author of many fine books. And tonight we're doing a recorded show, but the chat will be live, because it'll be a live premiere, at least that's the way it's supposed to work, because both of us will be traveling on our normal day. So we're recording this on Tuesday, and today we're going to talk about the father archetype, because someone had requested after we did the Lord of the Earth that we talk about some of the other archetypes as well. I mean, there are only 3, so it's pretty easy. So we're going to talk about the father tonight. And I'll just start with an introduction, and then we're just going to kind of talk about ideas associated with the father concept. I think I mentioned last week, and this is the way that it starts in Fire in the Dark, if you haven't read that, is that, we get the idea of the father, I think, this father beyond fathers, from looking up at our own father as being children and imagining this is what we can be. And then this ideal father is a father beyond father, because you can't become your father. There's something beyond him that you can become. And so that's the essence of the ideal. And in Fire in the Dark, I wrote this out, but we'll go into this as well, is that the function, each of the archetypes in Fire in the Dark has a function having to do with order. The idea of Fire in the Dark being that man creates order. The world doesn't need man's order to survive. The world exists without man's order, but man has to create his own order to make sense of things. It's part of what we do. So in the creation of order, the father creates order. The striker protects and expands order, the perimeter of order, and then the Lord of the Earth perpetuates order. So they all have a role to play in this creation and perpetuation and defense of order, this sphere of control. And that's really what our rituals are about, or at least our primary ritual, the fire ritual in the Order of Fire, is about establishing a point of reference in the universe, because there are no points of reference really. You can be anywhere, but to establish a point of reference, this is our starting point. And this goes back to ideas from Mercia Eliada and Sacred and the Profane. Like, you need an axis from which all other things are measured. So you have to create the axis of what is good, and then you kind of measure everything based on that. And that's how you have a firm way of looking at the universe. But we can actually talk, we'll just jump into that in a second, if I don't forget in the next 10 seconds. But we were talking about something today based on one of Chris's posts, and I can jump into that. But anyway, so the idea of the father is to create order. And what this involves is, we don't really talk about it, the father is representing, like, cradling a baby and changing diapers, because that's more Lord of the Earth stuff. That's keeping the world going. Like, that's doing all the things that are necessary to keep life going. The father would be the inseminator. Like, he puts it in and leaves. Like, he's out, because he creates the life. And also the role of the father in, like, a household, the father archetype is more the creation of family culture, and these are the rules. This is how we're going to run things. Just the basic structure, and that's where the father provides order. But all the basic things like changing diapers and all the other stuff, like getting food on the table, doing dishes, all the other stuff that they're involved in being a dad, they're more like Lord of the Earth kind of things, because they have to do with human life and how it works. The father is kind of a high-minded ideal, like a city planner or an architect. Like they're operating. They're not sweeping the streets. They're like, how does traffic flow? Like and so involved in that is obviously distinguishing between one thing and another. And this is where it gets into a fun wordplay that I talked about a lot in Fire in the Dark. Like the idea of a ruler as being a word that has 2 meanings, and both of them are attached to the father. He makes rules, is involved in measuring things like this is this and not that, and these are degrees of separation between these things, and then obviously ruler as being like a king or whatever. And these little tricks and plays of language are all involved in the Father very much in the idea of what he does in the creation of order. So it's all about like distinguishing between one thing and another, because that's how we create order, like a whole classification, taxonomies of things. This is how we separate one kind of thing from another. And that's what really the Father role is, that separation. And as I always say, when you name a thing, you also make a rule about it, because that means it is not another thing. It is just that thing. And so so that gets into language. And so before I talk too much more about that, I'll bring up the topic that Chris and I were talking about today, because Chris has an amazing amount of patience and interest in going back and forth with Christians, which is absent in me completely. But like so he has discussions with them all the time, goes back and forth. And so we were talking about, different things. And one of the things I brought up was book worship and the OODA loop. And this whole idea that one of the things that struck me was partially, this has to do with the advent of writing, I think, as much as anything, the advent of the written word and the copied down word, and then you get into books, and you get into this thing where you have book worship. Whereas if you look at like a culture like the ancient Greeks, now obviously they had writing, but their culture evolved a little bit more organically, and their religion evolved a little bit more organically, and so there was no real book worship. There's no central book,
Even the closest thing to that, which would have been the Iliad, right, is essentially a vessel for hero worship. Like, we're venerating the book, but the book is a medium for understanding and recognizing the hero. And in some sense, the story, which conveys the glory of the hero, is a continued existence of some kind. But the longing is for the hero, whereas in Christianity you have something different going on with this concept of the logos, this aletheia, where all scripture is God breathed. It's not like you're holding this book and like this is a window into this other world. It's like, no, this scripture is a part of the thing that we're trying to connect to, which is I think a little different.
Yeah. I mean, and the Greeks also had cosmogonies, but they were almost works of like imaginative fiction, because there were several. There were all kinds of people wrote their own cosmogonies of like, this is how the world was created, and there are some things that are common threads, and then there were some like details that are like totally different, and that might be the passage of time, different localities, different things that people believed around there, or just creative impulse of the Greeks. And you see the same thing. I mean, the Rig Veda, again, stuff that was written down and memorized, but there's a free-flowing aspect to it where there's like several cosmogonies in that. Like there's said that like the world was created in this way, and then some of the other I forget what they're called, but the other like scribes or the families of gurus, they create something a different way.
Yeah. No one seems to be claiming to speak on behalf of objective truth in the same way. Right. They're claiming this is clearly describes the world as I see it and as we all see it. But they're not saying my word is the truth in this grand declarative philosophical sense that we begin to see even before Christianity in some ways, in Neoplatonists, in the centuries leading up to Christianity, and some people after Christianity as well, it must be noted. And
also, I mean, but when you talk about Christianity too, there's two different books there. Obviously there's the old Judaic form, which that was, I believe, written down before. I mean, yeah, that was absolutely
So
yeah. Before that
it's
was written
it's
down before the New Testament, right? I mean, that was there.
it
They had their
wasn't
own book.
it actually wasn't codified before the New Testament, funnily enough.
Oh,
The New Testament as a cohesive piece, as a cohesive document, is in
right.
many ways, to my knowledge, older than the Old Testament. Obviously, there were books from the Old Testament that are much older. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I had been under the impression that Job was the oldest book in the Old Testament, although Dan McClellan is saying no, that's actually not true. There are, parts of Genesis are much older, and there's other parts of other books that are older. But as a cohesive document, the Old Testament is actually, ironically, newer than the New Testament. And the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, is older than the Hebrew translation of the Old Testament. Just
Fascinating.
kind of odd.
Well, I mean, because I figured they had their own temples and everything already before Jesus was even there. So I just
Mhm.
assumed that in the temples they had scriptures. You would think,
The
right?
scrolls, yeah.
But yeah, things like that. So that's interesting that would be the case. I mean, you think I wonder if
Mhm.
they were just lost or like
But
but yeah,
it's
I guess you said as a cohesive document. Yeah,
right. But what's cool about what you were saying about this more fluid, almost like creative fiction um, culture of cosmogonies and so forth is that it leaves room for men to develop this kind of father archetype. And I think you see something similar with classical Judaism. Now, people have their complaints about the effect that the Talmud has had on Judaism, arguably, but many of the Talmudic books appear to be like Platonic dialogues, and people who sort of don't understand what these books are trying to do will say, "Oh, did you see what this Talmud says about these people over here? It's very, very evil." And it's like those same sorts of people would be the ones to read Plato's Republic and be like, Plato thinks that a fascist communist society is the right government.
right.
It's like they're missing the the process of dialectic, and dialectic in the Aristotelian sense, not the Hegelian sense, but this thought prompting conversation that is trying to draw its students into, not to provide them answers, but to sort of provoke them into thinking about these hard questions in a little different way. Um, Maybe a fun example for like a Gen Z reader on the edgy side of the right wing is if they've read Bronze Age Mindset by our good friend Bap. Um, is at one point in that book he challenges the authenticity of Antarctica. He says, "I'm not sure I'm convinced Antarctica is a real place." Now, anyone who knows Costin or Bap knows that he's not being serious in that. So why would he put that in there? Well, it's a partially a joke and an amusing aside, but it's also a sort of uh, a jolt. Socrates, in his defense in the Apology, describes himself as a kind of this gadfly that's stinging Athens into activity and lively discussion. And these kinds of questions, whether in the context of a Platonic dialogue or a sort of Talmudic puzzle or in a clever cosmogony advanced by some Indic or Greek patriarch in some tribal village, can all serve that function and prompt other people to compete, to give competitive explanations for the world, as well as you know offer something useful in terms of a framework on how to think about the world for people who might be listening.
Yeah, that's funny. I used to do that all the time with China. I haven't used that example in years, but I'm probably because I have things manufactured in China and I talk to them all the time. But I used to use it as an example, like, do I know that China exists really? Like, because I've never been there. It's not like it's all kind of hearsay.
Yeah.
It was kind of an idea as to like, let's poke at the like, how do you know as much as you think that you know? and where does
Yes.
information come from? And that's an easy way. It's like an interesting. Just it's not that I don't believe China doesn't exist, but like
Yeah.
like I really don't know China exists.
Well, and
and
this
it's just kind of
invites
a theory that I have accepted.
yeah, it invites questions about epistemology. And I was listening to a fantastic little YouTube video. I shouldn't say little when it was 30 minutes long, but this guy said he could teach anybody the entire history of philosophy in 6 words. And those words are metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Metaphysics is beliefs about grand truths about what exists. So is the world chaos? Is it order? Is it made of fire? Is it made of water? What is the substance of existence, and in the grand sense? Epistemology is our theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And axiology is our theory of values. What is beautiful? What is the good? Does evil exist? And if so, what is it? These kinds of things. And then the other 3 words that he said fit into this are pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. And the basic idea is the pre-modernists grounded everything in metaphysics. They had these grand theories about what is. The modernists shifted from metaphysics to epistemology. How do we know what we know? And that really began with Descartes. And then the postmodernists said, no, that doesn't work. It's all axiology. It's all about our values. It's all about subjective taste, kind of. And you see this almost, you can easily see how it can cycle back into metaphysics. Like, where do these values come from? Do they come from nowhere? Or is there some metaphysical foundation that explains the sort of commonalities? Because there isn't an infinite variety of values. There could be, but that's not what we see. So it's just it was an interesting point to ponder, and I think it gets to the heart of the role of the father in trying to make these kinds of choices and deal with these kinds of questions. And my favorite sort of archetypic expression of the father, the easiest one to point to, is Lycurgus. Most people will know the story, I think, the founder of Sparta, who went on a journey for 10 or 15 years, visiting all the different cities, seeing how people lived, how they ran, which cities worked, which cities didn't. Then he came back and he wrote the laws of Sparta, except he didn't write them. He gave them, and based on his experiences, decided that they should not be written down for particular reasons. And then he made the Senate promise not to change anything until he got back. He had one more errand to run, and once he went on that errand and came back, they could talk about revising the laws. And then he just left and never came back. And that was how he enshrined it permanently in the city. Just like what you were just saying before about the father who inserts and then is gone.
And I'm out. Drop some knowledge and I'm out.
Right.
And to be honest, that's kind of my tendency in things. It's hard for me to I have a great idea and now you execute. Continue doing you guys work it out. But I like creating frameworks. That's kind of part of my nature. Something I wanted to get into, just because we should explore the aspects of the father that are in the book, and I was flipping through it, because that's the funny thing about being an author. I don't know if this happens to you. You probably have a better memory than I do, but what the hell did I say? You have to go back to okay, well, I wrote it all down and I thought really hard about it while I was doing it, and I'm like, oh, I forgot I said that. I gave a lot more aspects to the father than I really than I'd use on a general basis. And one of the things is, obviously, I talked about Mitra Varuna and Dumazeal and the dual nature of the father. And I put that in a variety of different ways. And the dual nature, I talked about something called the father in darkness. Because to be a good leader, you actually have to speak with confidence. And this is like a lesson that I have to learn over and over and over again. But to be a good leader, you have to speak with confidence. Before I forget, let me backtrack on the one thing that I wanted to say about our Bible discussion.
Yes.
Before I forget it, and then we'll get back into the father in darkness concept. But the one thing I wanted to say, because we talked about the flexible concept versus like this book orientation that is fixed, yes. Which is the Lycurgus story is actually kind of an interesting like sidebar on that. But the thing about a fixed system is that it's fixed. That's what we've ended up with. It's not just Christianity, but also like, but I just with like Islam, we've gotten, they have the fixed thing. There's several other religions that also exist that now have this fixed text, whereas like even something like I believe Indian, Indian Hinduism as it exists right now is actually just a collection of a lot of things, which is more in line with like ancient paganism. Yeah. And but this book worship, like the absolute truth exists in this book, and you have to worship the book, which Christians would offend Christians. But I mean, the thing is, we've seen pagans do it, like, and that's what's hilarious because it's such a tendency in the culture. Is that I've seen so many heathens go back and look at like the Eddas, which are of course written by Christians, which is the comical part of it. But they'll look at like the poetic Eddas and the prose Edda, and cite them like scripture, and like, no, this is what the gods said. And like, that's because of that Christian tendency, like that like to do this, and obviously the Muslims do this too.
Yeah. Can I risk getting offensive and controversial for a second? There might be some risk and danger of that with our Constitution, the way that it has become set, and the amendments in particular. And the one that I know, I think
I'm sure Kamala agrees.
Well, there's no set system that cannot be gamed or turned into its own self-contradiction, right. And I feel like we're running into that problem with one amendment in particular, and that's the First Amendment, specifically the freedom of speech. Now, there's a number of ways you can take that. At the time it was written, the freedom of speech had a very technical and precise meaning. And that was a prohibition on prior restraint, which means the government can punish you for what you say. It can hold you to account for things that it doesn't like. It can punish you even for mocking the uniform of the armed forces, which is actually a real statute passed in 1789, if I remember correctly, or in the 1790s by Jefferson, no less. But what they can't do is they can't stop you from saying it in advance. They can't prevent you from saying it. They can't preemptively censor you. Now, the normal belief that people have about free speech in the First Amendment is that the great, like the point where that right ends is shouting fire in a crowded theater. This comes from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. It's a terrible example. It was a bad analogy used to justify people protesting America's involvement in World War I. So like it is bad at like multiple levels. But the real point, I think, and the real point of challenge with the freedom of speech as we have come to know it after 1918 is libel, because libel causes real harm, material harm. Anyone who has ever experienced it knows that. It's yeah, right, more than most. And it's like the idea that that is just speech and is protected is would have been thought nonsensical at the time that the First Amendment was being written. They had a very another meaning, and so they've been using libel, and by they I mean the people who make their living off of the First Amendment, which is to say the freedom of the press, by libeling people. You know, and this is a point that is a deviation from the spirit, which is to say the Constitution of the people who actually wrote our Constitution. Now, does that mean that the Constitution existed prior to the Constitution? Well, if someone like Joseph de Maistre is to be believed, the answer is yes. There was a spirit of a certain way of being, a certain way of interacting with other people that constituted our American way of life prior to the Constitution. And the Constitution, beautiful of a document as it is, attempted at its best to capture that and to hold on to it and to protect it, to enshrine it. But it is not, it's the piece of paper is not itself the Constitution. It is probably the best in history, if I could be so bold, the best expression of a people's spirit. But no written document can do that completely. It's just not within the power of a subjective medium like language to do that. You're expecting too much of a document like that if you expect it to do it.
Right. Although, it does include provisions, and that's the one thing where it differs from the point I was making about the religion, about this book worship and the OODA loop, is that the inability to assess and reassess new information as it arrives,
right,
and change.
Well, and that's
because you have to be able to change if you're going to adapt to like the world as it changes with you and the environment and all different things and new information. You know, like shit, like the thing that new atheists all make fun of about the Old Testament are like weird things about shellfish and like stuff like that which made sense at the time. You know, but like different things change, so you need to change that stuff.
But the First Amendment is, I think, a very good example of that, because if you, instead of reading the Constitution, which is again, I am a huge fan of the Constitution. But if you read not the Constitution, but the work that went in on the backside, which is to say the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, the way that these people who actually wrote the Constitution were thinking through these problems was very, very practical. And they were very, they were not all in agreement about anything either. They disagreed with each other. That's why they have these two different sets of pamphlets, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. And, it's very easy to get wrapped up in something like the First Amendment in its post-1918 interpretation and see new problems emerge like Section 430 and the internet in general, and be like, well, the First Amendment says this, so that. And it's like, well, first of all, that's not even what the First Amendment actually said. And second of all, you can't just fall back on book worship in this way as a solution to the problem. That's not even in the spirit of the people who wrote this document to begin with. So I think it's another interesting illustration of the point regarding a document that I hold to be something close to sacred, but there is nonetheless danger in viewing it like a Bible.
Right. I posted it to the group, to the First Men, but I almost sent it directly to you. It came up in my Dune quotes thing on like X. Follow this account that just random bots Dune quotes, and it was something like give me sound and practical minds over written laws any day. And it's very much the theme of what we talk about a lot. And that is, obviously you need some kind of written laws because you need something to refer to or whatever when you're running a big society.
Yeah.
If you're writing a very small thing, you can depend on like really smart people. But if you're writing a really big thing, people need to know what the rules are. I mean, that was 3/4 of like 2020 was like watching the news to see what the rules are. You know, like that's they change them all the time. So you're like, what are the rules?
And the danger of that, or I think, is you get this downward spiral of people who relax and simply defer upward. Well, what are the rules today? And I think
Right.
a brilliant line that is maybe the most memorable line from the gentleman I was talking about earlier, Lycurgus, who, when he was laying out the laws for Sparta, he was legendarily asked by someone, why don't we do a democracy like Athens or somewhere? And his response was, you go run your household as a democracy and get back to me about how that goes, or something to that effect. And like there's the like edgy right-wing BTFOing of democracy there, which is like, yeah, that's funny. But I think that the more important and interesting point is that what he cares about and the opinions he respects are those who are already micro lawgivers of their own kind, i.e.
Right.
people who are laying out the laws in their own house. And implicit in the nature of his response is an idea that more important than laws themselves are a people capable of being lawgivers, with an understanding of what goes into the law, and hopefully with that understanding, not a diminished, but in fact an increased appreciation and respect for the law, because they know how they understand the weight of these kinds of decisions and so forth.
Yeah, understanding the weight of those kind of things is crucial. I mean, that's that classic line. I mean, I'm sure it's probably repeated in Game of Thrones, but the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Understanding like what that actually means, rather than like, I think this should happen, which is so much of our society. Like, I think that those men should be taken away somewhere bad. Or like just they should be away from, like they don't understand, okay, you're taking some dude to get prison raped, but like there's a different understanding of what reality is. I think that's why understand making those decisions.
That's why Scott Adams has been arguing that women should not have an opinion on war, or at least we shouldn't take their opinion seriously about war if they're not fighting it. And he says, and by the way, men should not have an opinion about abortion, or you should have your opinion, but we'll just let women decide that. We'll let women decide abortion, and we'll let men decide everything national defense and war. And
it's a little sketchy because like men are kind of involved in that kid as well.
It's certainly arguable, and one could make an argument. It's like, well, women have sons that are going to war, so maybe they want some say too. But like, we can disagree or put an asterisk or 4 after the argument while still grasping the sort of directional point that the argument emphasizes, which is the importance of having some personal investment involved in order for precisely. Nassim Taleb's book Skin in the Game is very worth reading. If there's a book that is worth reading besides The Way of Men and Fire in the Dark on the subject of the father archetype, I think Nassim Taleb is probably up there at the top. Skin in the Game in particular.
So anyway, we wanted to hit that because I think the point of being able to adapt, and in theory, like the founding fathers did actually try to create mechanisms for adaptation. Obviously, like amendments and things like that. Like, okay, they're going to need to change them. They're going to need to change some things at some point. But as you said, all systems can be gamed, and they set it up to be really hard. And it's just the way I just think that the scale of America became too big from I think what would have worked for basically what is the East Coast is a different thing from like what it works with, say, something the size of the East Coast like California. Like that's It's all kinds of there's too much in at stake.
Yeah, and there's these really tricky trade-offs involved. So like the anti-federalists had very good theoretical points. And they were really the ones who wanted to keep power out of the central government. They didn't even really want us to be one unified country. They wanted a union, a confederation of 13 different city states, essentially, micropolities. But the problem with that, and the logic was, we want to keep power decentralized. We don't want to have power in one place, as with a king. And that's how we're going to avoid the corrupting influence of power, greed, corruption, and all these sorts of problems. And that's a good argument. But the problem is, it's not the only factor at play. There are things like being able to negotiate economic trades. There's things like collective defense against much larger nation states that want to take your people and enslave them or conquer your territory. And so, like, the father, as a lawgiver and the order creator, can't just look at a single, like, solipsistic factor and try to optimize for that one thing, which is, I think, a problem many of our would-be tech overlords often lean into. They have to look at things, James Lindsay would hate me for saying this, holistically. They have to and this doesn't mean bring in some esoteric Gnostic understanding of what a human life is and this other stuff.
No,
but it means
that's
having
how I understand
experience.
holistic. Yeah.
Yeah, it means having experience in the world and weighing the balance of all of the factors, or at least as many as you can account for, that influence the well-being of a society and of a family and of an individual in how you make these decisions. And being able to say, I understand that this strategy would be best for maximizing GDP. That's going to be option 2, but there's this other thing that we need to do for national defense. And all the economists will be like, but it's inferior. And you're like, I understand that. We're still going to do this other thing because economic efficiency is not the only thing that matters. With, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different factors that play into what makes a good society in the specific context that your society, that your family happens to live in, geographically, sociologically, linguistically, religiously, culturally, what have you. So it's a very heavy burden, and a lot rides on it. And you probably won't get credit if you do things right, but you will get credit if you do things wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it is. Yeah, it's a shame that holistic has that connotation for a lot of people, that kind of hippy dippy, whatever, because what it actually means is really the way a mature, not autistic person has to look at problems.
Yeah,
not
solipsistically. Yeah,
and the same thing. It's like, they're just not in the way that so much of the error in society is not looking at things holistically. Obviously, like the body is a great example. Like, do you think you can just change one thing and it won't affect anything else? Right. This happens all the time. You find that out with just with injuries and stuff. It's like, well, if your elbow hurts, it's probably a problem in your shoulder, or you're like, it's because everything's connected, and you can't just tweak this one thing without having a possible impact somewhere else. So you have to have a holistic view of what is the overall health of this organism.
Yeah.
And
I think James Lindsay's critique of the word holistic, and it's a valuable one to bear in mind, is the people who say, well, these people only look at one thing, but our ideology, our frame of looking at the world is a holistic frame. And because anyone can label a particular ideology as better, our way is good, their way is bad. And you can do that with scientific, You can do that with holistic. You can do it with democratic. You can attach any kind of, and you see this a lot in the like psychotherapeutic world or the education world or any bill in Congress ever. It's just appending positive adjectives to the front of old words and pretending that you changed something critical when often they just made it worse by focusing in on exactly one thing. And holistic is just one of those faddish words that some people have glommed onto as a self-congratulatory label. But like, self-labeling aside, that doesn't mean that it isn't a useful reminder to not get tunnel vision in our own judgment as individuals. Whatever we call it.
In any kind of leadership role, that's what's actually involved. It's not the one situation. It's the situations that branch off from that situation. Like when we used to make decisions in tribe that is not named, one of the things that would come up, and one of the things I learned from that process was, okay, well, these two people were having a dispute. These two people were having a dispute. We can make a judgment on this and what we think is the right judgment. But what is the precedent of that? And how will affect all these other disputes? And like what then happen? What's the chain of where that leads? And that's like where, I guess this takes me back to my point that I was trying to get at with the Father in Darkness. The idea that obviously the Father in Light is what I call the Father when he's figured out what he's going to say. Like he's figured out the decision-making process. Here's the law. He's the lawgiver. I've figured it out. Or I've decided what I'm going to do to bed. Like I had to make a choice, so I made one.
Lycurgus when he's gotten back to Sparta.
Yeah. But the Father in Darkness is dealing with this reality of someone has to sit in a room or with advisors or whatever and parse through these problems of like, well, if we do this, then X, Y, and Z all also happen. Like there is not it's Gandalf, like even a wizard can't see all ends. Like there's just, when you do the one piece, there are other things that happen. So you have to try and like skip ahead and see that. And you can do that and get to a point of like paralysis by analysis, whereas like you don't want to make any moves because like I can see, well, I'm just all over the place with movie references, but like you become like, again, Paul Atreides, and all of a sudden like you can see countless different futures that happen from any of these like different points. So if you change one thing, then all these different things can change. So it becomes very like paralyzing as a leader. And that is one of the qualities of a leader, is that eventually you're just like, okay, this is the best one. Let's go. Because if you don't do that, then nothing happens. You have to take action. And then that's when you come out with confidence, even though that that you did all the work behind the scenes that like, I don't know if this is going to work out. But because you don't always know how things are going to play out, but you have to like try and anticipate that, which is the confusion and the darkness part of it, is trying to figure out the best, all the things that could happen, and then figure out what your contingency plans on, all that stuff, and then you give the decision, and you're Father in Light. You're the confident speaking part of it, you can't be a really good leader unless at some point you're confused. In some point you're like, I don't know what to do. This is not an easy decision. There's lots of things going on here. There's lots of moving pieces.
But you do need to be able to make decisions decisively.
Yes.
Kind of redundant phrasing there. I remember Douglas Murray very, I think, poignantly pointed out that the problem with governance by science, which is this sort of wet dream of many internet armchair governors with no skin in the game, fantasize about, is that science, the legitimacy of science is built on two rules, according to Jonathan Rausch from Kindly Inquisitors. No special pleading and no final say. So no one gets a specially elevated opinion, and there's no final answers to any question. We always have to be able to renegotiate these things. That's the foundation for the legitimacy of science, as this undertaking, this process, this theoria in the Greek sense, the sacred journey towards knowledge that we're not necessarily going to arrive at, but that we're consistently moving closer to, on the assumption that the journey is valuable and is noble and is worth doing. And the legitimacy of a leader is grounded in his specialness, and there's a final say, there's a final rule, and the objectivity of the law is based upon a finality, a final difference between the moment before a law is passed and the moment after a law is passed, and that no one gets special treatment, that like a law will apply to some people, but not this person, and we're going to change it so it doesn't affect our people, but then they come in power and then we change it again, and like that kind of instability in the law delegitimizes the law itself, which might be reminiscent from a few years ago.
I mean, that seems to make how things are actually working.
Which was Douglas Murray's point, because it was in the midst of COVID that Douglas Murray was making this point about why governance by science undermines, rather than getting the best of both worlds, it actually delegitimizes both of them at the same time, because you have government trying to finalize the dictates of scientists who are trying to tell the government, the serious scientists anyways, not the self-appointed spokesman, but the actual researchers, like, this is just our tentative finding. This is what we think is going on based on this study, but someone else could do a study. We're trying to figure this out. And the government's like, so this is what's true then, right? And the scientists like, no. So it, like, when the government claims science on its behalf, it actually epistemically delegitimizes the whole scientific process. But if they are to follow the science and change things every time a new study comes out, well, then everyone loses faith in the law, because it's not the same thing tomorrow as it is today. Right. And what often winds up happening is they kind of split the difference and just ruin both. And it's probably better just to keep those two things apart.
Right. So I guess to pivot to another aspect of the Father that I kind of thought of, obviously put in the book, and then was reminded of today when I flipped through it, is the role of, like, the split role where the Father is also the priest. Because we have you can have an infinite amount of archetypes, or you can keep it simple, and then like we were talking about last episode, I think there's a tendency in something like any kind of polytheism that you eventually just want to break them down to a billion little concepts, because there's different concepts, and that's again the rule. The way of the Father is to break things down into like smaller and smaller parts, until you get to like the atomic level. But the idea of the role of the Father is also and this is true of a lot of kings. Like king, also the head of the church. This is the king is the head of both, is spiritual leader, and that also gives him, in many cases for kings, that gives them their divine mandate to do what they do, and that's a tricky thing, but that's kind of required in a lot of situations, because you have to, people want to believe that the laws come from somewhere, and they have to come. You have a special power given to you by a higher power to make to make the law, and then they can accept the law easier than it's just some fucking guy. So the idea is that these two things are kind of linked, but I think it's important to talk about the Father as a spiritual leader, because that's another aspect of the job, which I don't think of as much, because I always think about the classifying and so forth. But the idea of the Father of because the spiritual part, not in the sense that you made a great point about spirits and stories last time, which I really liked. But in the sense of spirits and myths dealing with the emotional side of the human animal. I mean, because that's really what they tap into. Like we can have the cold rational side, which is going to do, here's the math of that decision. And then here's the beautiful story that goes with that decision. Here's our story. And this is the way that we tell it. And this is the way that, I mean, I'm doing this all week for those of you who know. I mean, I'm working on a ritual, what I'm going to say next week, and thinking about the structure of the ritual and how it gets laid out, and like what is most effective for our people. Like, will they understand it when I say this? Because we have a common culture like that we're creating. And so it was a kind of a joke I brought in the leadership forum. I don't know if you saw it today, but I was joking about it. I'm like, I mean, how have I gotten to the point where Maya is the best word to use? I'm like, now I'm just like, oh, I can't find an English work. I need to speak in Sanskrit. Oh, am I Ezra Pound now? Like, I need to oh no, I have to use the Sanskrit word. But it really, I was looking for a rhyme for something, and it really is the best word. And I'm like, well, our guys know what Maya is. And well, if they've listened to all our podcasts, they fucking should. And they all have to read the Rig Veda. It's part of our culture, so I'm going to use the word Maya. Because Maya means deception and deceit, and all these other big words that is
the Matrix.
This little tiny word.
Yeah.
It's all captured in this little tiny word that means deception and illusion and all that. So it is the correct word. But like, yeah, I mean, part of the role of being a priest is, knowing your people and kind of overseeing those myths. And I broke it into, I'd have to actually pull it out and look at how I broke this down, but I broke it into the priest in light and the priest in darkness as well. Because that is the idea that I think the priest in light would be like the Pope. Like, here is what we're doing. This is established. This is the da 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 da. Whereas the priest in darkness, I think I liken him more to Odin. Like, like the priest in darkness would be like the guy who has to like figure all this out. Like what I'm doing this week, like, oh, I have to sit around. I replaced meditation today with a nap. I'm like, I should really meditate and figure out what maybe something to come to me, but it's gonna be 3:00 and I get up at 4:30 and maybe I'm tired. Maybe I'll take a nap. And sure enough, I took an hour nap and the alarm came up and I'm like, the shadows grow long. like I got it in the nap. So like, nice. I guess that's my new like, I take downloads in naps now. Okay? That's part of being an old man, I guess. So it's an interesting development. But so those are two aspects I think that are also part of the father, that this priest aspect, and I also talked about it in the Fire in the Dark as I think I probably mentioned Pneuma. And that's a big difference and something that I think about a lot.
Are you saying Pneuma as in Pneuma, or are you talking about Pneuma as in Numa?
Numa.
Oh, okay. So
good clarification.
We're talking about law, not breath.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking
Greek
about
can be tricky.
Roman, not Greek. It would be Roman, not Greek. So,
no, I'm sorry, Roman. Yeah.
So it's
Latin.
Yeah, Latin. Obviously, like there's Romulus and Remus, and then the part of the story is that then Numa comes and kind of like locks everything down. Like he codifies everything. They're the like wild, crazy guys who, let's rape the Sabine women and whatever. Like all the like the mischief that they got up to in creating the city, and all the things that are necessary to create that, which is like
they brought
that ascended striker
spirit.
role.
They were kind of the clay. They created the clay that made the formation of a city possible, but they didn't shape it seemingly in the way that Numa did.
Yeah. I figured like really with Solar Idealism, like after I'm dead, like you and Dustin and like guys that are a little younger and have their families and whatever are probably just going to be like, well, Jack's kind of crazy and it's awesome, but like we need to have this. Let's stabilize this and codify some shit. We get what is the spirit of what he was doing, but let's like this is probably how it needs to work. I kind of see that as what happens after.
It's not a real religion until there's one big schism either. So
yeah. Well, hopefully we don't have that.
Yeah.
Well, that is real. That's 100% real. But I always assume it's going to be some guy gets mad at me and then goes off and starts his own like second solar temple. But that's what always happened with Church of Satan. People always broke off and like, well, this is the first Church of Satan. Like like they do it just with the Christianity. Like we do a different thing, and so like there's this is the temple of Satan and not the Church of Satan. And so the same thing. I mean, obviously we'll have people do that. That's just like part of the. As someone who's been involved in this stuff for long enough, I can foresee that. It'll still be dramatic when it happens, but like it is, and I'll have to like excommunicate them and all kinds of stuff. But I mean that is how these things work. But like hopefully we have like you guys around and whatever that will codify things a little bit more in a different way, in a more stable, established way, rather than like on Jack's crazy whim. And I think that's part of the natural process of how these things evolve too. In the same way that like someone wrote down the New Testament, like who knows what the fuck Jesus actually said. That's that someone like, well, we're gonna say it in a way that sounds a little better. Like that absolutely happened. Whoever Jesus was or whatever, like whoever wrote that shit down like 30 years after he died was definitely like, yeah, well, he said it like this, but like, like some massaging of that shit happened. Because that's just how this works. So yeah, it's just an interesting part of the way these things kind of evolve. So I hope we are lucky enough to one day get to the Pneuma phase. We're at 2 years right now, so it's a little early. And I'm still alive. But at some point, that is part of the way this whole father system evolves. Like it gets passed down and it becomes something that's not just created from scratch, but then repeated. So it's right. I think these are interesting parts of the whole father role
and it feels like the good father is not just a lawgiver, although that seems to have been the sort of role that was most venerated by the our founding fathers in the United States, for example. They looked up to Muhammad and Solon and Lycurgus and all these other great lawgivers. There was a frieze that was crafted at one point on some famous courthouse with the 13 great lawgivers in history. I don't remember all the details, but
I think I pulled the graphic from one. That father video, because it has the Lycurgus graphic, and that's what comes up on Wikipedia. So I used that right away, but I think it said it was from like a federal building or something.
Yeah, there's some frieze that depicts either 12 or 13 like great lawgivers like throughout history, and this was apparently very inspiring to John Adams in particular, and a few of the other founders. But or maybe it was later than that, because I think George Washington wound up on there too. But like the greatest of these guys, the guys I would include, Lycurgus, and in his own way, Muhammad. He's not my lawgiver, so he's no friend of mine, but you can admire the archetypal success of his role in this way. Is not just the law that they give, but the sort of story that they leave behind and the example that they make. There's nothing worse than like a lawgiver who was like kind of a pussy and kind of like not someone worth admiring. Like the thing that makes like Lycurgus, we probably wouldn't know who Lycurgus was if there wasn't this famous story of him being confronted by a mob and having one of his eyes taken out by the angry mob, and then half blinded, still losing one without one eye, turning around and chastising the mob and ultimately calming them down. Like this was a very tough, very physically resilient, but also mentally resilient individual, according to this legendary story, anyways. And we have something similar with like George Washington and the cherry tree. As far as we know, pure myth, and myth in the sense of fiction in this case. But maybe that doesn't matter in terms of like establishing the spirit that we are trying to embody, and that we look up to, the law behind the law, so to speak. And you can see something similar in Muhammad that's very appealing to a different group of people, and so on and so forth.
Well, look at that with Gilgamesh.
Yes.
I mean, like who they believe was the name of an actual king who actually ruled. But man, his story just got away from him. Man, his story got real bigger than life. And so like that's, yeah, I mean, you add things on, and we see that happen in the way that we mythologize, or the public mythologizes, because it's not always like within the control of the person themselves.
No, it's not.
The public mythologizes people. I mean, like I always think of Martin Luther King, because he's been mythologized to this like insane level because he died. And so like he's been like really uplifted in this other thing. But Washington, I mean, that was one of my favorite parts of reading the biography of Washington, was that he was very, very, and I appreciate this about him, very cognizant of what his myth was, and very aware of it, and very aware of symbols and how to use them, and what he wanted. And he was very aware of having all of his correspondence like cataloged and like written down, and like I'm doing something important and I want it to be remembered. And I wanted to be remembered just so. Like he was very, very aware of how important his role was, and what it would, and how history would view him. And so like the symbols and the choices he made were all very thought out, and I love that about his character, because the idea, there's this, like I was having this discussion even on X the other day. I bring it up over and over again. There's this idea that like real Chads just are, they just are what they are. And there are guys who are like that, but like they're just, like the real deal is just like a force of nature, and they don't think. They're almost like portrayed as being like unthinking beings, and they just say.
I think that's how those guys view Trump, because they can see a kind of instinctual power there, and it can often look that way. Individuals can look that way on the other side of 20, 30, 40 years of experience, but they didn't arrive there by accident. They didn't. I mean, they
didn't just thought about strategy.
they didn't just are themselves into that place. There was intentionality and thought behind how they got there. It's maybe not strategy in the sense that most people think, but like Trump as one example, Washington and all these other people, all of these people are examples of this. Like were thoughtful and did get there. I can't think of a single example of someone who it can be shown just are themselves into some high successful place of success or grand accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the just are is the learning from mistakes and making the right choices that get them to that place, but I mean, because we just are who we are, but like it is, I mean, the idea of there being no conscious process to me is in many ways a fiction.
That's part of who you are.
Men would encourage.
That's part of who you are. How are you going to are yourself out of what you are?
Yeah. I mean, like, well, the idea is like, I think that
I'm being glib.
That's a myth that great men like to allow people to believe. Like why would you not just think that like I like jumped out of the womb exactly as I am, and like never had an awkward period in high school, or never had like a whatever,
as if I was divinely chosen, maybe even divinely sired, perhaps. That's the only explanation for how I arrived at this place
I
of
keep
tremendous.
I'm selling that myth. That's like that's I'm insisting that's what's happened. I mean, even I remember like it made me laugh because he's like literally one of the funniest people I've ever met. But John Lavelle, when I was interviewing him for Chess Magazine, we're sitting on the beach, and he doesn't really miss a beat. He's like I said, one of the funniest people I've ever met in real life. Uh, and he's like, I asked him to start telling me about his backstory. He was like, well, vaginal birth. He's like vaginal birth. I did a backflip on the way way out, stuck the landing. Like
Nice.
perfect, like on, and that's the way you sell a myth, just on point, like and people want to believe that, even though he's super religious and like actually would never even want people to take that seriously, but it's a good joke. But the idea that you are somehow magic. I think Ajax does a good job of this. I can never tell how much of Ajax is actually like he's thought about it, or and how much of it is like I'm going to allow you to believe that I'm simply this Chad, that I simply just did this thing, and I've always been this way. Like he has a good way to split the difference about who he is and how he's just that way.
He seems to have it seems to be instinctual for him, but maybe that's me falling into the trap. But the only thing that breaks him is when people ask really dumb questions, and then he'll be like, all right, look, I worked for this, guys. It was a joke. It freaking stop asking dumb questions. Thoughts is not a question.
Yeah. But, I always assume with guys like that there is more going on back there, and there is a little bit more calculation than we know. Because maybe that's me projecting because I overthink everything. But I think that these guys are doing conscious, and I've talked to enough guys that seem to be that way, but then I've had the opportunity to talk to them in person, and they've actually thought about these things like in depth. The one that I always bring up is obviously because it's my old job, is masculinity, and I've met so many special forces like Alpha Chad, whatever dudes who have absolutely thought about masculinity at a deep, deep level and thought about what it means to them, and it will tell you that about when they were awkward in high school and like when they had to figure something out, and they just made the right course corrections. It made to get to where they are, and a lot of them have I didn't have a good father figure, I had this happen or whatever, and
there's also on the subject of instinct and these super alpha chads who are actually very thoughtful. I think the best explanation of this might come from the chess world. There are some grandmasters you can follow online. Magnus Carlsen is one example. Hikaru is another. There's a grandmaster. His last name is Candy. He's this black guy who's big on TikTok and Instagram. And he'll play these ridiculous games of like 10 seconds on this clock, and he'll play a full game where everything is pre-moved, and he'll just crush people. And you're like, how are you doing that? It has to be just instinct or something, until you learn a little bit about chess. And what it is novice players will just be playing moves as they see it. What's the best move in this position? Intermediate players will begin to start to think in advance. They'll plan out their moves. They're like, okay, what are the most likely responses? They'll plan 2, 3, sometimes maybe even 4 or 5 moves ahead. Really advanced players will generally be thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead, and then in really hard situations, they can sit down and think 15 or 20 moves ahead. They can really plot out just crazy lines in advance, and then he'll go here, and then I'll go here, and it works. And then at the grandmaster level, they're thinking 0 moves ahead again. There's no forethought at all. It all looks like it's instinct, but they didn't get there. They weren't born with that. The ability to play on that kind of instinct comes from having played thousands upon thousands upon thousands of games and such deep familiarization with different settings, with different piece dynamics and so forth, that what appears to be instinct, and kind of in some ways is instinct, was not just them R-ing themselves into being grandmasters. It's the result of passing through the beginner and intermediate and more advanced stages. And then only after developing that ability to think very far in advance do they reach a point where they no longer have to think in advance anymore, even though sometimes they still do. And I think that's many people like Trump or AJ Cortez or whatever other instinctual just is kind of father leader characters we might be looking up towards.
Yeah. It's one of the things I always say about like Jordan Peterson, or for that matter, like I would never want to get into a debate with a subject matter expert school teacher or professor of whatever I talk about, because it won't matter if they're right or wrong. Because if what happens is that if you have repped, I argued with all the objections to this like 100, like you've taught classes with kids asking you questions for hours and hours and hours and hours, and you've gotten up and presented the material over and over and over again in a thematic and consistent way. That's like, yeah, you are so ready to go and do that it's not going to be hard and it's going to look easy because it's there. It's that you've done this a million times. You don't have to think about it. It's just going to come out. I would have to sit and think about the paragraph that I'm going to say, and they've already said it like 1,000 times. And so that's how you get someone like Jordan Peterson. One of the things I think is amazing about him is, the one time I don't really pay attention to him at all, but like I got free tickets to go and see him speak.
Mm-hmm.
And he speaks on the fly for an hour, or, this is what he tells everybody, and I believe it. He speaks on the fly for an hour in front of a like
packed auditorium.
Yeah, a packed auditorium. And like that is, I mean, I practiced for weeks if I'm going to give a speech. But the thing is, he spent so many years teaching classes that, we're going to talk about this today. Okay, I've studied all this, I've talked about all these things hundreds of times. In the way that if you had to put me on the spot and interview me about the way of men right now, I could probably say the same things that I've said 1,000 times in podcasts and whatever. But yeah. I mean, he's had to go up in front of a class for an hour and speak impromptu about something he's a subject matter expert on. And so the idea that he can do it on the fly is really not that surprising because he's put the fucking reps in and he makes it look easy. Whereas the rest of us would be like, how do you just I think I'm going to talk about this today. And then you get to the end and wrap it up in a bow, without really missing a beat. Wow.
So we were debating in the last episode, we were talking about the Lord of the Earth. Where is the hunter? Is he a striker? Is he a Lord of the Earth? And I think there might be a similar question about where's the debater? Is the debater a father or is he a striker?
And is he a master?
Yes,
sorry, I was right there.
That's the highest. Only the highest level debaters get to be master debaters. But there's a few points to make about this. In some ways, I mean, we were making fun of Christianity a little bit earlier and talking about the book worship and so forth. But Christianity and Christian history has some interesting precedent here because the great doctors of the faith, some call them, are also sometimes called church fathers. And if you hear someone talk about church father, 9 times out of 10, they're talking about Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. And what Augustine and Thomas Aquinas did, first of all, they were debaters. Some might even say masters in the realm. But they also armed their adherents, their followers, with the arguments necessary to not just understand and believe this worldview, but to defend it, and even to more aggressively conquer other places with these ideas. One of my followers, and I hate that I can't remember who it was. I was in a DM conversation, and someone said, language is a martial art. And I love that description. And your comment about these teachers who get in all these reps practicing. It's like they're doing takedown reps. It's like they're doing their crosses or their side kicks or whatever, those kinds of reps. And the fact that those people have these reps should be inspiration for other people to, well, I should practice too. I shouldn't be defenseless. I shouldn't be one of the people that Aristotle is making fun of at the beginning of Rhetoric, who thinks defense with my limbs is important, but defense with the use of language is not, when the use of language is more distinctive of human beings than of animals. And part of the role of the father, if not necessarily to engage in those arguments directly, although very often that's the best way to get to good positions, is to, at the very least, arm your would-be followers and adherents, the people that you are creating order for, with the tools necessary to fight off the dragons and other forces of darkness, to arm your strikers. And I think that's a valuable. There's the father in darkness who is figuring things out. There's the father in light who is making the declaration. But there's also sort of the father in the command room, or the father in the war room, who is arming his strikers and preparing them with the tools that they need in order to do their task. To some degree,
it's a very specific role. I mean, it's in the father realm for sure. I always think of the father, and George Washington is actually a pretty good example of this, because he was anthropologically speaking a big man. I think more. I mean, he was physically a big man, but he was like, in the way that they talk about big men as being the people who are able to like negotiate compromises and are trusted by everybody. And that was kind of his superpower. Aside from he was a warrior and a good general, but well, people debate the general part, but he was a good warrior.
He was a good general.
He was courageous. Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have the tools to make that judgment.
I mean,
but
yeah,
but
fair enough.
Yeah. That's a discussion for a different group of people, really. That's like Michael Baldridge can like argue about that. It's more that the way that he was portrayed, at least in the biography that I read, is that he was more of a trusted figure between all these other people. Whereas, like, if you look at the founding fathers, there were other, and I'm not super versed on this, but there are other more hothead debaters that were more like the guys who did that part of the job.
Hamilton.
And he was the one who
Madison,
sat back and did this the decider. Like in that terms of like that, and I always think of that. That's kind of like how I like to think of what I do. Like, I want to be like the Godfather, where I like just whisper in somebody's ear, "Oh, here's what we should do." And then somebody else is the like listen here, this is what we're gonna do, and like does the whole, and has all those other tools. The rhetoric tools is kind of like a piece of the father work, but sometimes not always the best piece. I mean, in modern society, I mean, it is in terms of like the president role or whatever, that is kind of the part of the job, because of, well, debate night was tonight. And apparently like Vance did really well, but I mean, which you kind of expected. He's the guy who has that skill set. And so like it is a valuable skill set, and it's something that you need something to do. But it's different from like the initial creator role, I think, to a certain extent, and maybe even the king role. It's like it's one of the top advisor positions. Like in that role, but it's in the father category because it's not a fucking striker.
Well,
like that's a different field.
in Fire in the Dark, you described the best fathers as ascendant strikers.
That's
and
true.
when you look at these church fathers, many of them
Yeah.
are ascended strikers in this verbal format. They began in debate. I mean, the scholastic school of Thomas Aquinas was just like straight point counterpoint debate in
Right.
this manner, anticipating the counterpoints and then countering the counterpoints. And you see that when you read Summa Theologica, it's like it's just straight that. He's not like making long arguments. It's just, here's a definition, here's a possible counter to that definition, here's why that counter doesn't work, and like all the way through. But he becomes a church father after ascending through that, and maybe there's some like maybe there's something correct in the order there, where it's not like the father creates things and then has to come down and defend it. But maybe you start on the debate and by sort of overdeveloped experience over time, you get a sense of what are the strong positions and what are not, and it puts you in a position of experience where you can then become a father. But the debate would come first, which would be, I don't think that's how most people would imagine it, but maybe there's a parallel there.
I mean, perhaps. I don't know. It probably happens that way maybe half the time.
Yeah. Because if you think of a Christian apologist, there are thousands upon thousands of apologists out there. There are not thousands upon thousands of church doctors, church fathers. There are like a dozen in all of history.
Well, and that's the same with the strikers and ascended strikers. I mean, like, obviously there are tons of warriors, but they don't all become king. Like that's. I mean, that's it. There's other qualities involved. I think that. I mean, I don't think that you can get to. I don't know.
But there
has to be some physical experience. There has to be some experience of like on the ground clinical stuff, which isn't necessarily the same thing as debate. But like in the sense of like, I have experience. Yeah. Like I've worked with this situation enough times that like I see what's going on there, that's bad. I see what's going on here, that's good. Da, 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 da. And then there's the kind of more intellectual side of that where it's in words, which is where more the debate thing gets. And I would say that like that's the side that I mostly have done online or through writing. Like I used to debate the shit out of people. Like that's how I came up. Like I used to argue with people all the time. I just don't do it
writing and books in general are, in my opinion, a like higher form, maybe the highest form of debate.
Because you're anticipating arguments like we've talked about before. You have to make everything make sense.
Yeah, it's not like a Facebook comment, which is maybe like the lowest form. and ironically, the worst.
As we established earlier in the conversation, the lowest form is the emoji.
Oh right, yes. I was gonna say either that or the book length Facebook comment. Hard to know which is a. But
anyway, we should probably wrap this up here. I said we were only going to do an hour because we're doing a recorded thing.
Convey a sense of the father, what he's about, the parts, and conveyed, maybe to people who are new to solar idealism, trying to figure out what is the father. Is this the order creator who figures things out, establishes distinctions, delineates what's us, what's them, what's here, what's there, what's this, what's that. And orients people. You were talking about OODA loop before, and I feel like that the father as the orienting director of everyone else that gives shape and the possibility of success is I think at the heart of it.
I mean, orienting is one of the perfect words. I mean, that's like said, like we talked about the axis earlier. I mean, that's what the orientation starts with. You need that starting point.
Axiology, yes.
Yeah. So you need that to begin with. But anyway, those of you who have tuned in or are discussing this later or during, I may jump into the show. Well, I guess we'll already see if I did or not by the time we get to me saying this. It's weird to do it beforehand. But thank you guys for watching. And thanks, as always, for buying stuff from the Order of Fire store. And because we want to obviously grow that. That's what helps kind of support all this stuff. We really want to grow the Order of Fire and the First Man of the next few months. It's closed right now. Membership is closed right now, but once I get back from doing some of these the next two events, we're going to open it up again, and I'm really excited about where that can go. I think it's time, and we have a very well established thing going here, and it's just a matter of hammering away at it. And anyway, thank you guys for watching, and stay solar.
Stay solar.